You have your lesson sheets. Go ahead and open those up to 40 years of wandering. 40 years of wandering. We were able to finish up our study on the spies last on Sunday, and so we're able to move on into the discussion of the wandering, and we will probably actually be able to complete this potentially tonight and move forward in the study on Sunday. But we'll just see how that goes, not sure. We had a good discussion on Sunday. Fewer questions, I guess, in these two lessons than we've had in other lessons might actually be part of the reason why we're able to move a little faster through them. But we want to talk about this narrative, and I suppose really a better title, if I was to try to make a long title of this, would have probably been 40 Years of Wandering, its cause, its explanation, and its reasons, not so much the 40 years themselves. And so we're going to talk out of Numbers chapter 14 more about what caused God to decide to make them wander for 40 years, and what were some of the reasons that He gave, and what was the challenges. We know the basic cause is what? We talked about last Sunday. Unbelief. And what scene did we just have? The spies, right? We just dealt with those spies that are going into the land, and when they come back, and in fact, that's going to be the specific definition of why He picked 40. You're going to see that later in the narrative, but that's the specific reason God illustrates as to why He chose 40 years was because the spies had been where? In the land for 40 days and 40 nights. And so equal to the days you spied out the land, I'm going to give you 40 years for each, or 1 year for each day for the wandering in the wilderness. And we'll see that before we're done this evening in our study of Numbers chapter 14. So if you want to grab your questions, and I'll show them to you on the screen as well, but we begin this portion in really about verse 11 of Numbers chapter 14, where we ask this: why was it so amazing that the people did not believe? Okay, that's right. There could be lots of reasons for that in some ways, but there's a specific reason given in verse 11, and it's because they had already witnessed all kinds of signs. And basically, when we reference signs, what are we talking about? Miracles, or the demonstration of God's power. If you don't believe you can go take on the giants and the fortified cities, if you don't have the confidence to go in and challenge the inhabitants of the land, your belief in God's power isn't what it ought to be. And what God basically is saying to them, you should have never come to that conclusion because I've already shown you how powerful I am. I showed you by giving what back in Egypt? 10 plagues, including the final one, including God's power over what? Life and death, right? That's an important factor for us to remember about the Israelites, is that they have, from the moment they depart Egypt, they have an understanding, they should have a vivid understanding of God's power over life and death, because He destroyed the firstborn, right? But in the midst of that destruction, He provided life unto whom? And those specifically who did what? With the blood on the doorpost, right? It illustrates God's power over life and death. So, if you're afraid of your life to go in and fight the inhabitants of the promised land, that should be erased from your mind. God's already demonstrated His power over that. That's right. So, right. And so all of the evidences you need to have trusted in God were there. They chose not to believe. And as a congregation, they chose not to believe because of whom? Those 10 spies that come back and give the evil report. I can't help but imagine that if all 12 of those spies had come back and concurred with Caleb's assessment, which was what? That's right, let's get after it, is basically what he said. That's how we would say it anyway. He said, let's go to it at once. Let's not delay, let's not haste. Let's get after this. God's promised us this land. If all 12 of them had come back saying the same thing, what do you think the reaction of the congregation would be? They would have stepped up and went exactly as they had been instructed to do. And so the influence of these 10 spies is far-reaching, and it's caused the people to even build among the spies' disbelief. It builds a disbelief among the people and creates a challenge for them moving forward. So, what's God say about them, or what His displeasure is bringing to them in verse 12? Which is question 2. See, he said he wanted to do with them. He wants to smite them with the pestilence and disinherit. That's an important thought here. This isn't just about God seeking some kind of retribution and punishment just for the sake of punishing them. Yes, His anger is kindled, and the word smite isn't a pleasant term. He wants to strike them down because of their disbelief. But more importantly, His idea is I want to make a disconnect from them. When you disinherit somebody, if I had anything to give, what are you basically saying? You receive, and I am doing what? I'm done with you. I have disconnected myself, and in some senses we'd even say you're not part of what? You're not part of the family anymore. When you think of inheritance, you think of family, right? That's what generally happens. People in families inherit from their family. And so the point is, when somebody is disinherited, the idea is, I'm disconnecting you from family. Now that sounds harsh, but I want you to see it that way because that's what God said He wanted to do with them. He wanted to say to them, you're no longer my children. You're no longer my family. That's heavy. And I think that's an imagery we need to see, because just as wonderful and beneficial it is for God to say, I want to give you an inheritance through Jesus, He also, as illustrated through the Israelites, that He has the ability to pull back and say, I can disinherit you as well. And that's an important lesson, though not pleasing, but an important lesson.
Later on in the chapter, he does kill the spies as well.
Yeah, and we'll see that before we're done in our study. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Right. And with that, Tom, I think the lesson isn't necessarily ignore the majority. The lesson of that is right, no matter whether it's the minority or the majority. Irregardless of which way it is right, and that's where our focus needs to be. And had 10 of them said, let's go, and 2 of them not, then it would have been but what's right is right. But you're correct in that picture here, that they let the majority rule, not let right rule in that moment. Okay, so I'm going to smite them. I want to smite them with pestilence, disown them, if you will, disinherit them. But what concern does Moses bring up concerning that in verses 13 to 16? Okay, so the Egyptians, now I want you to think about this with me for my mom gets on me all the time for saying fur, and she can hear me right now, sorry. But she says, it's for, not fur. I call it my own charm, but anyway. And Moses said, read with me verse 13. I want you to see this context. And Moses said unto Jehovah, then the Egyptians will hear it, for thou broughtest up this people in thy might from among them. And they will tell it to the inhabitants of this land, they have heard that thou Jehovah art in the midst of this people. For thou Jehovah art seen face to face, and thy cloud standeth over them, and thou goest before them in a pillar of cloud by day, and in a pillar of cloud or pillar of fire by night. Now if thou shalt kill this people as one man, then the nations which have heard the fame of thee will speak, saying, because Jehovah was not able to bring this people into the land which He sware unto them, therefore He hath slain them in the wilderness. So there's an interesting kind of, to me, thought going on here in this narrative. His first thing he mentions back in verse 13 is whom? Okay, so all these things are happening, right? The Egyptians will hear it, for thou broughtest up this people in thy might from among them, and they will tell it to the inhabitants of this land. They have heard that thou Jehovah art in the midst of this people, for thou Jehovah art seen face to face, the cloud standeth in fire. Basically, he's saying, the Egyptians, when they travel into Canaan, when they travel into this region, what stories are they going to tell? about these people that are encamped outside the borders here? Well, they're going to tell people about what they saw back there in Egypt. They're going to tell people about water that turned into blood. What body of water was that? That's the Nile. That's the Nile River. Okay, that's the lifeblood of Egypt. And when Moses came around and turned the water into blood, we had frogs everywhere and lice and flies, and we had all of these pestilence and plagues. And then our firstborn were destroyed. I mean, you don't survive the 10 plagues and not want to go what? Do what you would do. You go tell somebody about it, right? You don't have that kind of story and not go tell somebody. So, here's the situation. Here come the Egyptians. They have opportunity to come into the promised land. When they get in there and they begin to talk to the inhabitants, they're going to talk about this great God who was able to deliver His people out of Egypt and brought great pestilence and challenge and problem and was able to save and rescue them, and they're camped out there in the wilderness of Paran right now. But, Moses says, if you destroy them as what? The American Standard uses an interesting phrase. As one man. In other words, if you do what? You wipe them all out. You just destroy them all. If you destroy the whole nation as if it was one guy, then the inhabitants of the land are going to say what? He could get them out of Egypt, but he couldn't get them out of Pandora. That's right. He had the power to get them out of Egypt, but he doesn't have the strength to take us on. And so rather than face that challenge, he'll just... So Moses is pleading with God. This isn't about what the Egyptians will think. And that's a mistake I think even I might have made if I just quickly read through this. He's not concerned about what the Egyptians already know. They already saw 10 plagues. They know what God can do, and they'd have to be in denial, no pun intended. I'm waiting. Never mind. They'd have to be in denial to try to reject the idea that God had power, right? He's already delivered them out of there. He's already had the 10 plagues, and He already destroyed what? Their whole army in the midst of that sea. You can't come out of Egypt and not know the power of God. So this isn't about the Egyptians and what they think. Moses is pleading with him to consider what the inhabitants of the land will think. You brought us all the way out here. You showed your power in Egypt, but if you destroy us out here in the wilderness, the inhabitants of the land are going to think you're powerless against them. And that's right. You had all this power to do all these things to Egypt, but you can't finish that which you promised. And that's the exact problem, or the scenario, if you will, that Moses presents to him. You know, I don't presume... I want to be cautious about because we only know about these conversations between Moses and God from what we can read. But I'm going to give Moses some credit. He's got some failures about him. There's no doubt about that. And his frustration about the people and their conduct is going to cost him in the long run as well. But he has an amazing conversational way with the Lord. And it's kind of an odd kind of thing, because it's almost Moses is reminding him, even though God doesn't need reminded. But Moses is putting him into remembrance of certain facts. He's pleading the case. How often has he had to do that? Right, numerous times has he had to go before God and plead the case. And he's pretty good at it. Moses is pretty wise at the things he puts before the mind of God in order to have an effect upon God. Here's my thought from that. And maybe this should be a sermon sometime, but we're on it now, so we'll talk about it now. I should stop. Moses has but do we get to communicate with God? We speak to God, right? We talk to Him through His Son. And there's education to be learned about how Moses converses with God. And we can learn, because the subject matters will be different, but the effective method, if you will, of praying and speaking to God that has the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man. And Moses is a great illustration of that. Worthy of some time. We don't have time to talk a lot about it tonight, but just think about that sometime. Sit down and just kind of look at how Moses approaches God and the kinds of things that he uses, and you'll see effectual, fervent communication and prayer. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah. 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 He uses, I guess in some senses, pointing back to the Egyptians saying, why all of that to stop now? And he continually kind of plays on that mindset in these moments. Yeah.
In our what buttons to push, he understands what's important to God. And I find that phenomenal.
Yeah.
That kind of relationship.
He's that in tune with the mind of God that he's able to make these requests and thoughts and things known in such a way that has that kind of effect. I mean, I don't know anybody other than Jesus within Scripture that had this kind of effect upon God in relationship to Him. Yeah. I mean, you think about for lack of a better term, the courage that it takes for Moses, but and I guess that tells us a little bit about how passionate Moses is about the people. He feels a genuine tie from the moment he takes a life over his nation. I think that even though he's gone for 40 years after that, I think that passion for the people is still in him at 80 when he returns to lead them out of bondage. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah. Right. You could be the new Abraham, and Moses doesn't take that offer. He wants to save the existing nation that's there. Let's add question 4. Whoops, not the way I have to do that. What characteristic of God did Moses appeal to? That probably should have been plural, by the way. But what characteristic of God did Moses appeal to? Okay. If we wanted to create a single word in relationship to that, we could say his long-suffering nature. He appeals to how patient God is. But read the text with me. Begin in verse 17. Let me put it back up on the screen. And now I pray thee, let the power of the Lord be great, according as thou hast spoken, saying, Jehovah is slow to anger, abundant in loving kindness, forgiving transgression or iniquity and transgression, and that will by no means be clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, upon the third and upon the fourth generation. Now, I'm almost half afraid to say this, but I need to ask this question. Where did he say this? Chapter 34 of Exodus. Remember that chapter that challenges us in more ways than you can shake a stick at in some senses. Exodus 34 verse 7, I believe, is where this moment occurs, if I'm not mistaken, unless I've got my thought processes incorrect. Let me take a quick look with you and make sure I am not just guessing, but that keeping, there it is. Jehovah, O God, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, verse 6, abundant in loving kindness and truth, keeping loving kindness for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. That will be by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity. Okay, that phrase, So what's Moses doing in Numbers 14? Go back. That's God saying it, I believe, in Exodus 34. What's Moses doing? Yeah. I pray thee, let the power of the Lord be great, verse 17 of Numbers 14, according as thou hast spoken, saying, God, all I'm doing, I'm not asking you anything that you haven't already spoken as who you are. I'm simply appealing to the very character and nature of who you claim to be back there in Exodus 34 when we had to spare the people after the first time down off the mountain, destroying the tablets and receiving the new ones. He said, this is the description that you gave of yourself in Exodus chapter 34. You're slow to anger. You're abundant. What a great word. You're abundant in loving kindness. You're forgiving iniquity and transgression. But what does he also say? And I read a little bit this afternoon trying to make sure that I had a decent grasp of what he means by this, and that will be by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, upon the third and upon the fourth generation. What do you think he means by that? Okay, and I think that's part of this. That's part of this. Go ahead.
He's not forgiving them of the, he may be forgiving them of the sin, but he's not forgiving them at least of the consequences.
Right.
They're going to suffer the consequences for what they've done.
Okay. So when he made that statement in Exodus 34, and Moses brings it up here, though he has loving kindness, though he's forgiving, though he will remit those sins, though he will blot them out, he'll do all of those things. The two thoughts I had were, number one, forgiveness doesn't always get you out of the consequence of action. God can clear the slate and say, I won't hold you spiritually accountable for that. But the damage may be done, and I may not be able to reverse the consequences of action. Just because God can erase the sin as though it didn't happen in His mind doesn't mean that all of the subsequent challenges that come from that conduct just disappear. I think He's reminding them of that. Go ahead, Roger. Yeah. And He says that even my sin has been forgiven, but my sin is still ever before me because He was still reaping the consequences from it. And that's part of this, I believe, that God's reminding them. And so from that I also thought, so if that's the case, God's forgiving, He cleans the slate, He'll blot it out, He's merciful, He's all of these things. But that doesn't automatically erase the guilt, or rather that doesn't always erase the consequence of guilt, but also it reminds us that we shouldn't take advantage. Moses, you keep coming back to the well. You keep coming back, and you keep coming back, and you keep coming back, and at some point, there can become an end to this, where the opportunities are gone, and you have been given ample opportunity to do what's right, and I was forgiving, and I was loving, and I was kind, and I was merciful. So don't take it for granted as if I'll never bring justice. Because there may come a point where justice is what God determines to bring forth. And also then a sad kind of thing he says here, there's nothing, and this is kind of a text that some people run to try to illustrate the idea of inherited sin. Nowhere in this text does he talk about the concept of inherited sin. What he does talk about in this is inherited consequence. He does talk about that the actions of this generation can last to a second, third, and fourth generation of people. And I think we could evidence that a million ways. How the decisions and choices of one generation, the consequences of those choices, will affect subsequent generations. And you could do that in your own mind's eye in short order. How you could think back to things that were a certain way so many years ago, and how they still affect people today. And I'm sure you've all heard the old story about the putting the ham in a roasting pan. They always cut the ends off, always cut the ends off, and always cut the ends off. Finally, they asked the great-great-great-grandmother why that family tradition was passed down, and her reason: she didn't have a band big enough. She didn't have a pan big enough for the whole ham. She had to cut the ends off. But second, third, and fourth generations of people were lopping off the ends of the ham because in their mind's eye, that's the way it was supposed to be done. Just a quick illustration of what we're dealing with, but only in more sober and serious matters. Consequences come. And what I do can, and I think I can accurately, most certainly will, affect my children, and potentially their children, and potentially their children, and potentially the fourth generation to come from me. Right. Yeah. Though they may, under 20 of the men may get to see the promised land 40 years later. If you're 19, you'll get to see it at 59. But you still have to pay the 40-year price for what the leadership had chosen to do prior to that. But think of that in two ways. By the way, don't view that just as negative. People hear that kind of thing. They ruined it. I mean, they ruined their opportunity to have a positive effect on the next generation. But it didn't have to be that way. It's also an empowering thing. It's also a great opportunity to think. I was sitting in on a session one time with some preachers in a discussion about writing. And anyway, one of the preachers was asked, "Why do you write? Why do you write material?" And his statement I found interesting. He said, "I want to preach 100 years from now when I'm gone." And he said that was one of the ways that he could continue to preach. 100 years after he was gone, he could continue to preach because the things that he had written could still be available to people to read. And that, so your effect on future generations doesn't have to be negative. In other words, embrace the opportunity, embrace the empowering kind of thought process that I don't live on this tiny little island where I don't have any effect whatsoever on anybody. That I have an opportunity to affect people's lives well down the road. And don't get hung up on yesterday's failures either. That's kind of a bad place to be too. We can sit around and consider all the things that we didn't do that had an adverse effect, but that isn't going to change those adverse effects. What I need to do is concentrate on the opportunity that's at hand to change the course of the future for whomever and whatever I can change and motivate. It's an empowering thing. Scary at times, yes. Extreme responsibility, sure. But also exciting in its own little way to think that you can have that kind of long-lasting effect on people by doing the right things and making wise choices. So he appeals to what God has already said. He reminds him of his character and appeals to that power that God has already illustrated that he can offer. So he asks for pardon in verse 19 of the iniquity of this people, according unto the greatness of thy loving kindness, according as thou hast forgiven this people from Egypt. Even until now, they've always needed it, Lord. They've always needed it. From the time we left Egypt until this moment, it's never stopped. And so what's God say? Verse 20. Okay, your part, it's cleansed. But I will cleanse them of it. I won't hold it to their charge in terms of the sinful conduct. But in very deed, as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of Jehovah, because all those men that have seen my glory and my signs, which I wrought in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet have tempted me these 10 times, have not hearkened to my voice. Answer to question 5 is, how many times? That's right, 10 10 times. Do you see that term 10 times as specific or symbolic? I see that as symbolic as well. 10 Commandments. And the reason for that is we could actually go back in history and count up more than 10 moments where they challenge Jehovah. So I don't necessarily see that as meaning they only did it 10 times. It's somewhat symbolic of I've repeatedly offered you pardon and forgiveness. This group of people, and they've tested me and they've tried me at least 10 times. And what was going to happen? Okay. So, I always forget I got to go on the side for that. He says, all of the men from when? You don't learn that till later. Okay. 20 years and up. You learn that in what verse? That's in verse 29. You have to answer question 8 with question 6. I should have put them together, but I didn't want to take them out of order in the context. But all these men if you back up, let's go back to the text for a minute and look at it together. They've not hearkened to my voice. Surely they shall not see the land which I swear unto their fathers, neither shall any of them that despised me see it. We learn more about that. That's kind of generic because just the way the description is. But we'll see that more detail come in verse 29. But who gets exempt from this? And I want to pause here for a minute. Specifically, who's he mentioned in verse 24? He specifically mentions Caleb in verse 24. And that's it. And I asked the question in question 7, why? Okay. The immediate question is or the immediate kind of answer we would come to is he's one of the two that brought up a good report. Right, and he's the one that begins the communication process of that. But there's a specific reference to him that I want to look at that for a minute. The text said that he had a different spirit about him. In terms of leadership, was there anything different between Caleb and the 10? As just general leadership? Did they have the same status? That's the word I'm looking for. Yes. Okay? Chosen equally. Were they probably equal in strength and familiar with their responsibilities in those? All things being equal, you wouldn't necessarily be able to see stark contrast. These 12 were the cream of the crop, right? They're the top ones. They're the leaders from all of those tribes. The difference between Caleb, and you could throw Joshua into that mix, but specifically mentions Caleb here. And the others? Yeah. And it's attitude. But the reason he believes and the others don't, the difference that God describes here, is Caleb had a different attitude about it. His spirit is what made his assessment of what happened different. How often do you find that to be true even today? How the very same set of circumstances, the very same set of issues, the very same set of problems, the very same things can be set before different people. And depending on the attitude that people have, will have a tremendous impact upon how they react and respond and what they do in those settings. There's no difference. And so, if Caleb is to be honored as a righteous man, which he is, and if Caleb is to serve as a great example for us, and he should, maybe the lesson learned here from Caleb is that belief and the right attitude towards that belief go hand in hand. That the right spirit within him is what motivated him to say, arise, let's take that place at once. And sometimes we wonder where our faith problem lies. And maybe our faith problem actually lies in an attitude problem. We fix the attitude, and we may just be shocked at how quickly the faith returns to where it needs to be. But we don't want to admit that because we don't want to admit we have a what? I don't have bad attitude. Who are you talking about having bad attitude? I don't have bad attitude, right? You know, we're back in denial again. Okay, we're back in denial again, and we don't want to admit that our bad attitude is what's causing the problem. It's why I don't feel good. It's why I don't act good. It's why I don't think good. It's what